He's been bleeding this estate dry for years. My sister's voice carried across the conference room like she'd been rehearsing the line for months. Maybe she had. The estate lawyer didn't look up from the folder in front of him. He just turned a page slowly, the way someone does when they already know what comes next. My sister sat across from me with her husband beside her. Both of them dressed like this. It was a business meeting they fully expected to win. She had that look on her face, the one she always got when she believed the story she was telling. The problem was, this time, she was telling it to the wrong room. The lawyer cleared his throat. "Before we continue," he said, "there's something here that I think needs to be addressed." He slid a document across the table. My sister reached for it, then she stopped. Her husband put his hand on her arm. The room went very quiet. "My name is Vincent Holloway. I'm 37 years old, and for most of my adult life, I was the family member people talked about but never talked to. The unreliable one. The one who had potential but never followed through. The one my sister had practically carried since our father got sick. That was the version of me that existed in holiday dinner conversations, in phone calls between relatives, in the careful language my sister used whenever someone asked how I was doing. She had a gift for it. Not outright lying. She was too smart for that. It was more like selective editing. She'd mentioned that I'd lost my job without mentioning that I'd left to help care for our father full time. She'd bring up the loan I'd asked her for without mentioning she'd offered it, and without mentioning that I'd paid back every dollar. She'd shake her head sadly when relatives asked about me and say something like, "Vincent just struggles to keep his life together," and the conversation would move on before anyone thought to ask for a second opinion. I stopped correcting her after a while, not because I gave up, but because I understood something about her. The more I argued, the more she got to play the patient sister dealing with a difficult brother. It was a game I couldn't win by talking, so I stopped talking, and I started paying attention. Our father was a general contractor who built his business from nothing in Windsor, Ontario. He wasn't a wealthy man by most definitions, but he'd worked for 40 years without taking a vacation he didn't cut short. And by the time his health started declining, he had a paid-off house, a commercial property he rented out on Willette Avenue, a small RRSP that he'd faithfully contributed to since the 80s, and a life insurance policy he'd held since before my sister and I were born. He didn't talk about money openly. That wasn't his generation. But he made it clear, in the way he made everything clear, quietly and without ceremony, that he wanted the two of us taken care of equally. My sister became his power of attorney 3 years before he died. That was my idea, actually. I was 29, working out west on a pipeline project, and when our father's first cardiac episode happened, I wasn't there, my sister was. She took him to the hospital. She handled the paperwork. She called me that night and told me it had been taken care of, and I heard in her voice something I didn't recognize at the time as satisfaction. I told her she'd done a great job. I told her I trusted her, and I meant it. I came home 8 months later when the doctor told us his recovery wasn't going the way they'd hoped. I moved into the spare room, took on the daily care that my sister had managed from a distance with phone calls, and casseroles dropped off twice a week. She didn't offer to help more. She said she had the kids to think about, and her husband's job had gotten demanding, and besides, I was already there. It made sense for me to do it. She said she'd handle the financial side so I could focus on Dad. I said okay. I was tired. My father was tired. The house smelled like medication and old carpet, and I didn't have the bandwidth to question the arrangement. For 2 years, I watched my father shrink, not just physically. He'd been a big man, broad shoulders, hands like a carpenter's, which he was, and he got smaller by degrees until the man in the hospital bed looked borrowed from someone else's life. But his mind stayed sharp longer than his body did. He knew what was happening. We talked in those last months, more than we ever had, about his own father, who'd come from Newfoundland with $40 and a trade, about my mother who'd died when I was 11, about what he hoped for us. He told me once, near the end, that he was glad I was there. He said it the way he said most things, straightforward, no performance. I didn't make a big deal of it, but I wrote it down in a notebook that night because I knew I would want to remember it. He died on a Thursday in November. It was raining. My sister arrived at the hospital 40 minutes after I called her. The grief was strange. It wasn't sharp. It was more like the pressure you feel in your ears when a plane descends. A constant, disorienting weight that made everything slightly unreal. I managed the arrangements because someone had to. My sister was emotional in the way that drew attention, which meant I handled the practical things, which suited both of us fine. Then we sat down with the estate lawyer 2 weeks later, and things started to not make sense. The commercial property on Ouellette. My father had mentioned more than once that he intended for it to be kept in the estate, rented out, and the income split between us. He'd said it plainly. I had no reason to doubt it. But when the lawyer laid out the current assets, the property wasn't there. It had been sold 14 months earlier. I looked at the lawyer. I looked at my sister. She was studying her hands. "When did that happen?" I asked. "Dad decided it was best," she said. "It was too much to manage with everything going on. He didn't mention it to me. He didn't want to worry you. You had enough on your plate." The money from the sale, around $340,000 after fees, had gone into an account I wasn't a signatory on. My sister had been managing it. The proceeds, she explained, had been used for his care costs, for the home retrofits, for the medical equipment. I knew those things existed. I had no idea they'd cost that much. Over the next few days, I tried to shake the feeling and couldn't. The numbers felt wrong. His care had been largely covered through his Ontario health benefits and the long-term care supplement. The retrofits, a roll-in shower, a stair lift, some grab bars, hadn't come close to that figure. I was there. I'd seen the invoices, or some of them. I didn't say anything to my sister. I called an old friend from high school who'd become a financial planner in Waterloo and asked him, casually, how I would go about understanding what had happened with an estate I was a beneficiary of. He walked me through it. Then he said something that stayed with me. "You have the right to request full accounting of any transactions made under power of attorney. She has a legal obligation to provide it." I didn't know that. Most people don't. I started carefully. I requested a copy of the full accounting from my sister by email so there was a record. She sent back a spreadsheet. One I could tell had been put together quickly, with line items that were vague and totals that didn't match the figures she'd given me verbally. I didn't point that out yet. I printed it and put it in a folder. Then I started filing requests. Ontario's land registry gave me the full history of the Ouellette property transfer, including the sale price and the receiving account. I requested records from the RRSP institution. I found a letter my father had written, not a formal legal document, but a handwritten note tucked inside his address book, describing what he wanted done with his things. It wasn't a will amendment, but it was dated, in his handwriting, and it was clear. I hired an estate litigation lawyer in London, Ontario. A woman named, well, she asked me not to use her name publicly, which I respect. She reviewed everything I brought her and then sat across from me in her office and said, very calmly, "There are significant irregularities here. This will take time. But you have a case." I want to be honest about what the next 8 months felt like, because people sometimes tell this kind of story as if the protagonist floats through it on righteous certainty. I didn't. I had weeks where I was convinced I was wrong, that I was the difficult one my sister had always said I was, that I was turning a family grief into a legal grievance because I couldn't handle loss like a normal person. I almost called my lawyer 3 separate times to tell her I wanted to drop it. Once I got as far as typing the email, before I stopped and went for a walk and came back and deleted it. What kept me going wasn't anger. It was the notebook. I'd go back and read the things my father had said, in his own words, and I would remember that I hadn't invented any of it. My sister called during those months, occasionally, the way she always did, breezy, surface level, asking how I was settling back in Windsor. I'd found a job at a property management firm, which struck me as ironic. I told her things were fine. She took my silence as surrender. That was her second biggest mistake. Her first was the text she sent to our cousin in Sudbury, forwarded to me accidentally, in which she described me as still trying to cause trouble, and mentioned that she hoped I'd move on before I embarrassed the family. She didn't know I'd seen it. I screenshot it and sent it to my lawyer the same afternoon. The formal meeting happened not in a courtroom, but in a conference room at the estate lawyer's office in Windsor. My sister had demanded it, actually. She wanted to close out the estate without litigation, which told me the litigation was scaring her. She brought her husband and a lawyer she'd hired, Howe Tow of Chatham. I brought my lawyer and a binder. My sister opened by talking about how much she'd sacrificed, the nights she'd worried, the coordination she'd managed, the toll it had taken on her marriage and her children. She wasn't wrong that she'd done those things. What she left out was everything else. When she finished, my lawyer set the binder on the table and opened to the first tab. The sale of the Ouellette property, documented, including the transfer to an account in my sister's name only, and a subsequent partial transfer to a joint account she held with her husband. The home care invoices, the actual total, sourced directly from the agencies in the province, which came to roughly $61,000, not $280,000 as her spreadsheet implied. The life insurance policy. My father had named both of us as equal beneficiaries. My sister had filed the claim 9 days after his death, listing herself as the sole beneficiary, and the correction had never been made. There was also the handwritten letter. My lawyer had it professionally authenticated. It wasn't legally binding in the way a formal will amendment would be, but it was admissible as evidence of intent. And in the context of the other documentation, Its meaning was unmistakable. My sister's lawyer asked for a recess after the third tab. They were gone for 22 minutes. I sat in that conference room and looked out the window at the parking lot and thought about my father's hands, how he'd taught me to measure twice before you cut, how he'd said more than once that the truth doesn't need you to raise your voice, you just have to make sure it's in the room. It was in the room now. When they came back, my sister wouldn't look at me. Her husband was looking at his shoes. Her lawyer sat down and said, in the flat tone of someone delivering bad news they'd been paid to deliver, that his client was prepared to discuss settlement. The resolution took 3 more months to finalize, partly because these things always take longer than they should, and partly because my sister pushed back on the life insurance correction twice before accepting it. In the end, the estate was recalculated based on the actual documentation. I received my half of the insurance payout, just over $94,000. The discrepancy between the actual care costs and the amount attributed to them in her accounting was treated as a debt against her share of the remaining estate. Her lawyer negotiated the framing carefully, avoiding words like misappropriation, but the math was unambiguous. There was no dramatic confrontation, no tearful apology. At one point, my sister sent me a text saying she hoped I knew what I'd done to the family, and I read it twice and then set my phone down and made dinner and didn't respond. There was nothing to say. The documents had said everything. What happened to the family after is hard to describe in clean terms. Some relatives chose sides and told me about it. Others chose sides and didn't. My cousin in Sudbury, the one who'd forwarded the text, called me and cried and said she'd always known something wasn't right and felt terrible for staying quiet. I told her I didn't blame her, because I didn't. The situation my sister created was designed to be unverifiable from the outside. That's how it worked for as long as it did. A few family members stopped speaking to me entirely. I won't pretend that didn't sting. These were people I'd known my whole life, at weddings and Christmas dinners and Sunday afternoons in backyards, and now they treated my name like a subject change. I grieved that quietly, on my own, the same way I'd learned to grieve most things. My sister and I don't speak. That's the version of the ending that's most accurate. There's no closure scene, no moment where she admitted anything. I used to think I needed that. I used to lie awake and imagine the conversation where she finally understood what she'd done. Somewhere, in the 3rd year after everything settled, I stopped waiting for it. The expectation itself was the thing exhausting me, not the absence. What I didn't expect, what I want to say clearly because I think it matters, is that the hardest part of all of it wasn't gathering evidence or sitting through legal meetings or watching my family fragment. The hardest part was the period before I started, when I had to make peace with the possibility that people would see me as the one who caused the damage. There is real social pressure in a family to absorb injustice quietly and call it keeping the peace. My sister had counted on that pressure. She'd built her whole strategy around it, and for a long time it worked. What she didn't count on was that I'd spent 2 years in that spare room, getting quiet enough to hear clearly. My father used to say that the most important thing a person could do was understand the difference between making noise and making a record. He was talking about construction, about the difference between showing up to argue with an inspector versus showing up with your permits in order. But it applied to everything. I still live in Windsor. I still work in property management. I take care of an old rescue dog named Fig who sleeps on the couch and snores like a freight train. And most evenings I cook something simple and watch the river from my kitchen window and find it genuinely good. Not good in the way people perform goodness on social media, just good in the quiet, ordinary way that feels like something you've actually earned. I'm not angry anymore. I want to be specific about that, because I think there's an assumption that stories like this end in triumph, in a rush of vindication that rewires everything. That's not how it worked for me. The anger left slowly. The way a bruise fades, you don't notice it going until one day you press on the spot and feel nothing. What replaced it was something simpler, a kind of steadiness. The sense that I know exactly who I am and where I come from and what my father actually said. And no one can take that from me by telling a different story to the right people in the right rooms. The truth doesn't require an audience. It only requires that you write it down, keep the receipts, and be patient enough to wait for the moment when the room is finally ready to hear it. That moment came for me in a conference room on a grey October afternoon, with a binder on the table and a parking lot visible through the window, and my father's words sitting quietly in a folder, waiting to be read. They were worth waiting for,